So if you can take your seats as we begin today's message. So the title of today is to John 5, chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 1 through 9. And this is the story of a man that was healed at the pool of Bethesda. Okay, so again, John 5, there was a feast. Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Now, a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. And the day was the Sabbath. This man that was lying on the floor, who had been waiting years for a miracle, and he asked him, "Do you want to be well?" And the man responded with reasons as to why he had not been made. Approach him, asking him, "Oh, why are you still sick? Oh, you poor unlucky man." No. He asked, "Do you want to be made well?" The answer is so simple. Yes or no. More complicated than they really are. He asks us, do we want to be well? Because he has a solution to a better life. But we come up with 50 million excuses as to why our lives are not where they're supposed to be, or why we cannot serve him. When we create excuses for not getting closer to God, we prolong the time it will take for us to receive our blessing. This man spent 38 years in infirmity, and all it took was 1 second for him to be healed once he followed Jesus' word. So what are excuses? What is the purpose for them? Excuses are explanations typically created to justify failures, avoid consequences, or shift the blame. Although excuses come in different forms, they have the same purpose: to get out of owning up to our actions. It's because excuses lets us blame and shift responsibility to someone else out loud. And I say out loud because it's something that we know. So we say it out loud so that way everybody else thinks, it wasn't us, but we know internally there's consequences. So let us go to Luke 14, chapter 14, verse 15 to 24. And we're going to be reading the parable of the great. So again, Luke 14, 15 to 24. People with him heard these things. He said to him, "Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." Then he said to him, a certain man, actually, this is Jesus saying this now. So then Jesus said to him, a certain man gave a great supper and invited many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to those who were invited, "Come, for all things are now ready." But they all with one accord, "I've bought a piece of ground and I must go and see it. I ask you to have me excused." And another said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I am going to test them. I ask you to have me excused." Still another said, "I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come." So that servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to the servant, "Go out and quickly into the streets and lanes of the city and bring in the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind." And the servant said, "Master, it is done as you commanded, and there is still room." Then the master said to the servant, "Go out into the highways and in the hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say to you that none of those men who were invited shall taste my supper." Now, to preface, back in the day, people would send out two invitations to, banquets, to dinners, to weddings. The invitation to tell people was the first one, and the second invitation was to tell people when the banquet was ready. So this wasn't an on-the-spot invitation, which I totally would understand, because if someone called me and said, "Hey, you want to go get coffee right in this moment?" I may come up with a couple of excuses not to go, especially if I'm already in bed in pajamas. No, so these people had already gotten this invitation, and they had accepted. That is why they got the second invitation to tell them that the dinner was ready. And I get it. We know things can happen, plans change. However, Jesus purposely used the word excuse in verse 18 instead of reasons, because the master knew that they weren't valid justifications for missing that supper. They were actually, kind of ridiculous. So during that time, people wouldn't have bought land. And I think people still wouldn't have bought land I probably wouldn't have purchased a house without going and looking at the condition, making sure it's not they didn't catfish me with the house. So back in the day, they wouldn't have just bought a land. So there was no need for him to go see it to make sure that it was okay, because he had already seen it. Same thing with the oxes. He wouldn't have gone to go see them after he purchased them. He wouldn't have tested them either. So those were just a bunch of excuses to not go to that supper. And then the man that got married, why wouldn't he bring her along? So him saying he got a wife, that's why he's not going to show up, isn't valid. And as Jesus tells this story, he tells it in third person. So he says things like, "The master said," "the servant said." But if you pay close attention, on the very last verse, he switches the narrative and says, "For I say to you that none of those men who were invited shall taste my supper." He does this so we can understand that the purpose of this parable, the purpose of him telling the people there, was that supper was meant to signify the supper that Jesus is preparing for us in heaven. The supper mentioned in Revelations 19:9, when he said, "Then he said to me, write, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb." Without even realizing it, they denied the biggest blessing of their lives. But us, we know exactly what we are denying when we create excuses for not to come to God. And I can guarantee this is one supper you do not want to miss. That carne asada at the park is no comparison to what Jesus has in store for us in heaven. It's definitely in our human nature to make excuses. The first excuse was made by Adam and Eve when they first sinned. They tried to blame each other when God came to them because they were trying to excuse themselves from the disobedience. And I remember when I was little hearing this story, my dad would always say, you you can't hide from Jesus. You can't hide from God. So I have no idea why they were even trying to hide. You know, we look back on it, and it's kind of dumb because we know that Jesus sees everything. But how many times have we created just as equally empty and unreasonable excuses? God is everywhere. He sees all and knows all. He can see right through our excuses by what's in our hearts. As a young adult who has been in church since I was 10 years old, I have said it and I have heard young people, it's so common for young